Okay, now we're started. So, I want to talk about logging and logging solutions today. There's a whole bunch of applications kind of centered around log management, log correlation, kind of gathering events, doing things with them. I want to talk about one that is kind of interesting called graylog. But before we get into that, we're going to talk just a little bit about like where log files go and kind of how logging would be configured in a Linux environment. And that really relies on thinking about syslog a little bit. And syslog is one of the primary ways that programs send logs to system log files and things like that. And then we're going to get down this whole rabbit hole of trying to install graylog, and it's not something that's fun at all or exactly very nice. But once it gets up and running, it's at the very least kind of interesting to think about. So let's just look at logging really quick here. So I'm in the iLab on Ubuntu 1. And what we really want to think about is the syslog. And when we think about syslog, we go into var, log, and there's syslog, and that's one of the files that we'd think about. And that has a bunch of just generic events from miscellaneous system services and everything like that. But what's also interesting to look at is the other things in var log. And there's other things that originate log. And there's other things that originate from the syslog, but they're actually filtered into different log files as they're sent. So the other one that's very important is authlog. And that just shows when users logged in, logged out. The really important one that I think of is SSH logins. So it would say accepted PUBG for user from their IP address and then when it was accepted. And that's really important to think about if, for instance, you have a policy that says you're not going to allow root logins on any of your servers anywhere. And for some reason you see a root login, you probably want to raise a flag or something and take some action to correct that. But it's also interesting to think about monitoring when users are logging in. If users are logging in the middle of the night when they're only supposed to be logging in during the day, like that's not something that would really make sense, and you'd probably want to, again, take an action or trigger something based on seeing that information. And that's one of these things that this correlated log management can help us do. Basically what we do is we take all of our logs from this one Ubuntu 1 host and send them to a centralized log management system. And then what that will do is it will parse through the logs and allow us to search them, set up filters, and all of the things like that. But before we go any further on that, let's think about authlog or syslog just a little bit more. So etc r syslog conf is where we configure the actual syslog. And this file isn't particularly interesting, just setting up a few miscellaneous things. What's actually more interesting is the r syslog-d files. And we can see we have 20 UFW, 50 default. And when we see these configuration directory here, so this is the configuration directory, basically all of these files in this directory are all pieced together into one configuration file that's then actually used. But when we look in one of these configuration directories and we see multiple files that have these kind of 20, 50, 70 prefixes, it means that files that come before other files can actually take precedence over other files. So when we're doing this later on, our rule to send our syslog log events to our graylog environment actually needs to take precedence before these other ones before they're processing. But we'll get into all that later and all of that mess. But just to look at something like 50 default, we can kind of get an idea of why certain log files are being formed the way they are in our environment. So we can see we have a couple filter things here, and it's kind of the best way to explain this is to think about how a program would actually send things to the syslog. So I'm just going to Google the syslog man page because it's a little more readable. But basically, there's this open log, and you would say what you are logging and some of the options about it. The main thing we want to say is what they're logging, and there's a couple options down here. So we could say auth, we could say cron, we could say kernel, we could say mail, we could say a bunch of different core-like sections that are being logged, log user and so on. And right there you can see that's the default, so if you don't specify anything, it would just come up as user. But as syslog receives those messages, it would say any of those class of auth messages are going to be redirected to specifically auth.log, and so on and so forth. And like all mail messages are going to go to the mail log, all kernel messages are going to go to the kernel log. And so it goes what the class is, and then I believe this is the priority. So you can see all mail, or I think star is actually of level alert or above. I believe that's the case. There's actually, so there's levels here, and it goes down to debug. So it starts at debug, and that will print the very most information, then info, notice, warning, error, critical, and alert. So when you go to say syslog, you'd use one of those right here, and you'd say the priority. So you'd open it, you'd say what your identity was, and then you'd say syslog priority, and then what your actual message was to be sent. And that's kind of just how programs would actually send messages. And that's interesting to think about when we're thinking about all this logging stuff. So one of the things that eventually we'll do here is we'd specify a rule that just is star.star, so that will capture of all classes. And then I believe there's a certain bare level that star is actually. Star doesn't include like the debugging messages and the info messages, but it includes enough of the information that I would want to see to actually use it. At a bare minimum, I would want to see like the SSH logins, the session open, the service has been started kind of messages coming through across. And we're kind of going to come back to that and think about it all later. So before I move on, I'm actually going to check and see how much memory this VM has. So there's a lot of moving parts to this log management solution. And when I was doing it, when I was testing it, I needed to have at least, I think, 2 gigabytes of memory to actually make it work right. And I don't know if you'll be able to do that, change your memory in your VMs. But I'm going to try and go and change the memory just quick here, and then we'll work on a solution later. If this is actually going to turn into a lab, I might do something much simpler. But I think this is a really cool solution to log management. I kind of want to talk about it because of that. So I'm just going to bump this up to 3, just be good there, and 2. And then we'll get ready to install all of this. So there's this page and architectural considerations for graylog. We're really going to set up this minimal environment. So there's a single server with graylog, and then 2 services, MongoDB and Elasticsearch. And Elasticsearch and MongoDB, there's a lot of things that you could talk about with both of them. But basically MongoDB in this context is just a database server used for storing information about what we're executing, and kind of metadata about what's happening in the system. And then Elasticsearch is actually where all of the logs go to. And one of the things that Elasticsearch is very good at is you have a lot of text information. It's kind of been parsed out a little bit, and what you're able to do is write queries that are very quickly able to search a lot of information. And we're kind of going to look very briefly at the syntax of how all of that works if we ever get this thing installed. But this is kind of the very base minimum configuration. Once you get into a larger environment, this is very scalable. It's kind of designed to be built out so you can have any number of log events. You could have thousands of log events a minute in a large environment. But basically you can scale it up to have multiple Elasticsearch clusters, multiple MongoDB instances, multiple actual graylog instances ingesting these log events and then deploying or like distributing them out amongst the cluster. But this is just really a crazy setup, and we're not even going to get into doing that stuff right now. So we're going to need to do some things to get all of this started. We're going to need to install Elasticsearch, install MongoDB, and install Java, and this is all based in Java, which is interesting, I guess. So there's two packages. We can do OpenJDK for Java, and then we can do MongoDB. I'm going to wait for a second for that VM to start up again. And I'm just going to install it on Ubuntu 1. And then what I'm going to hopefully do eventually is retrieve log events from Ubuntu 1, specifically those syslog messages, and then also show how to configure Nginx logging too, since we have Nginx running on Ubuntu 1 from our WordPress days. Open JDK 8 headlets. And these are a bunch of packages, and they're going to just be very painful to install, but we're just going to kind of go through it. Error resolving. That's interesting. Did I do any IP table stuff on here? No? What in the world? So its DNS is broken for sure, as usual. How did I break DNS this time? Is the normal question. This is getting off track even faster than I thought it would. No server could be reached. So normally you'd put your DNS servers in resolve.conf, but that's kind of been changing a little bit recently. It's saying dynamic resolve.conf, don't put things in here. I'm just going to say I don't care and put it in there anyway. And now it works. It's just stupid things why that wasn't working. And now DNS is functioning. It's literally DNS, and like I have spent so many hours like fiddling with DNS things, and DNS is the absolute bane of everyone's existence. So that's pretty much the reason why I haven't spent time talking about DNS, and that's one of the core services in a Linux environment might be DNS, is because I have such terrible luck with DNS that like I don't want to impart any of my terrible luck on you guys. So we're just gonna pretend that that was all fine and just continue on. So Java, it's gonna take a while. We can find. Well, let's navigate to this page inside. So there's no Elasticsearch package, so I'll have to install that manually. Just search for it. Download. And there's actually a video. So one of the things is there's actually, if you're more interested in Elasticsearch, kind of in data analytics stuff, there's actually a really good video on their main page. I won't show it right now, but if you are interested in this more, definitely take a look at that and how it actually works. One of the things we have to do is graylog doesn't support the newest version. The newest version just came out, but they do support the 2 series release versions. So we got to go back a little bit and find that one. So say Elasticsearch versions 2.4.4, I think it was. Or 2.4.1, whatever. Then just hit download, hit the Debian archive, and since we haven't worked with these Debian files before, maybe we have, I forget if we have or not, but pretty simple to work with. The only thing is it's downloaded on Xubuntu right now. So I'm just going to go back here, I'm going to copy the link address and wget it on Ubuntu 1 instead. And then we still have to install MongoDB, and then we have all of the dependencies configured. And there's one thing that we have to do to configure Elasticsearch. We have to change the cluster name to graylog. And one of the things that happens with Elasticsearch is when you're using it programmatically, you search basically for a cluster on your network, and the cluster just has like kind of identification features which will inform graylog where it's actually at. So if we haven't worked with Debian files before, we just say dpkg I for install elasticsearch.deb. And that one went pretty well. But so dpackage is kind of the underlying thing behind all the apt get stuff. And one of the things that might happen is we install a Debian file like this, but when we're using dpackage, it doesn't do any of the dependency management, it doesn't install any of the other things. So if, for instance, in this log we saw something like dependency not installed or error or something, we could say apt install f. We don't need to do it now, but it's worth remembering. And that will fix all of the dependencies basically and install any missing dependencies that we haven't installed yet. Okay, so we got Elasticsearch. Let's install MongoDB. A bunch of packages again. It's going to take a minute. And then let's just think about what we're going to do next. So there's this graylog 2.2 repository latest.deb, and that basically just has the information about where to find the graylog server. It's probably worth talking. I don't know if we've talked about the apt or the sources.list and everything about where packages are actually found, and it's probably worth spending a minute talking about that. And let me see if I can copy this from over here. So this was found on their installation guide. It's just here for kind of ease of use. Okay, I was able to copy that through. Control C. Okay. So I got MongoDB installed. So when we're configuring apt, I guess, the way that we find all of our packages is in this etc apt sources.list. And this is basically the URLs of where all the packages are. If we were to navigate to, it's probably worth doing, navigating to one of these, if I can figure out how to click a link in the terminal. And I just deleted my other link, and well, there it is, still there, never mind. If we were to go to the, gonna work this time? Go to this address. Nope, it's not getting copied. Basically, if we go to that address, there'd be a a tar file or a gzip file of a bunch of information that describes where all the packages are at, what the packages that are available, basically all the metadata related to the packages, and then it would also contain all of the packages. And these are the core Ubuntu sources. Now, just like we saw with syslog, there's also a sources.list.d directory, and inside that list.d is other basically sources. But what's nice about the sources.d file is if you're installing something, you just make a new file and drop your content in there, and you don't have to really worry about overwriting things or breaking the rest of the sources.list. And we'll see that when we install this package, what we should expect to happen is just a line be created inside of the sources.list.d directory that describes where to find the graylog components. So just like before, dpackage, install, graylog, repository latest. Then if we go back in ls, we can see there was just that new graylog.list created right there. If we were to look at the copy and paste is just not working now. You can see it basically was just an easy way to add that repository. So moving on, we just say apt update, and as we were looking at that, we see we have new lines in our apt update here. We have that packages.graylog2.org, and now we can actually go ahead and install graylog server. And that's going to take a minute. What I'm going to do is SSH in again and really quickly go in and configure Elasticsearch. The configuration that we have to do is super easy. Go in this elasticsearch.yml, and all we say is cluster.name graylog. Then we'll start up Elasticsearch, and we'll MongoDB, and then we'll come back over here and hopefully this is all installed. Alright, so we did that. Now the two things that we have to do, we'll try and zoom in here a little bit. These are the important things, is we need to set the root admin password. We need to manually generate the SHA-256 hash, and we need to set a secret value for web session things. And this is kind of interesting stuff to look at too. So we have two different commands. We have SHA-256 sum and we have pwgen. So pwgen is one that I actually like a lot, and it's worth installing, I'd say. Even for just generating passwords, so pw password gen, pwgen. So by default, if we run pwgen, it generates, I believe, 8-character sort of random passwords. They're mildly rememberable, but there's two configuration parameters we can pass. We can pass the length, so let's say we want passwords of length 10, we could say 10, and that would generate random passwords at 10. And the second configuration parameter we could pass to it is actually the number of passwords we want generated. So we could say 1, it would give us exactly one 10-character password. We could say 10, give us exactly 10 10-character passwords, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the ways we could generate a secret. And one of the things that we have to do is generate a 64-character secret. So we want 64 characters, and we want 1, and that's what we have. Let's see if copy and paste is going to work this time inside the VM. What the heck is that? That doesn't make any sense. I'm going to close out of the terminal here and see if the terminal is just broken. And this isn't like me trying to copy and paste from the outside into the VM. This is me already on the VM trying to copy and paste. So it's just broken. Everything is just broken. One. Oh, I need to SSH still. Of course, I just push Control D too many times. There we go. So it was just the terminal was broken. Stupidly annoying. Anyway, if we were to go into graylog server.conf, we'll see going down the first one that we need to do. There's password secret. We're gonna, or actually, that's what we just generated, and we can see that's what they were using to generate it too. That pwgen. We'll just put that in there. There are 64 characters. And then we need the SHA-256 hash of our password, and we're going to do it just like this. So we're going to echo the password into SHA-sum, and we can use SHA-sum-A256, or we could say SHA-256-sum. So we're just going to say this. So the one important thing to note is echo by default puts the new line on the end. If we don't want the new line, like our passwords don't usually have new lines, we need to specify the -n to echo to turn that new line off. We can see there's no new line at the end there since our terminal prompt just continued right on there. And then we're going to pipe that straight through SHA-256-sum. And that will give us the password hash that we're going to put in our configuration file. So just copy that. Put that in there. And then that's the core of what we need to set up. And beyond that is kind of the things that turn on the web interface. And we're going to continue to do that. By default, graylog is kind of just a node that will intake data and process it through Elasticsearch. And you could have kind of a headless graylog system. But what we're going to do is turn this web enable on to actually be able to use the web interface. So we'll go over to web enable, turn that to true, and then we might have to come back here and change the web listen URI to actually be 0000, so all interfaces. And I don't know, I don't recall offhand if we're going to have to do that, but we'll just start it up and we'll see what happens. So we have MongoDB running, we have Elasticsearch running, and then we'll finally start up graylog. Graylog server, I bet. Yeah, graylog server, that was where I went wrong. So it's one of those heavy job applications, so it's going to take a while to start up. I don't have HTOP installed, so we'll just kind of watch the status here a little bit. So we're waiting for that port 9000 service to start up, so that's the actual web interface. One of the things we can do here is when you do systemctl status, it's tracking the PIDs of what's running in there. So I'd look for specifically this 7D11 or PID, and then when I was looking through my netstat output, I could grep for 7D11. And then we can see that the web interface actually has started up, but it's only on that localhost 9000. So I'm going to go back through really quick, running out of time here, and going to configure this to be all interfaces. And I believe we're going to have to change the REST API 1.2. Yeah. This REST listen URI, change that to be 0s2, and then just restart graylog. Server, it's going to take a while to restart again. So once we see that started up, we should be able to navigate to port 9000 on our Ubuntu One box, log in with a username admin and the password that we had set. In this case, password 1! As usual. And then we'll see how much time we have left after that. The two things that basically I want to do is use the syslog generic input. So there's just a generic input where you can just put in random syslog file or entries, and what basically we do again is we say all categories of all levels, and then direct them to localhost and then the syslog port, and then this has the protocol. And if we have enough time, again we're running out of time, we'll see if we can get into that. And then then the other thing we can do is actually send syslog entries from Nginx. So we can go into our Nginx configuration, add the syslog and configuration directives, which will send this information here to graylog, and a few other things. So hopefully everything started up all right. I'm just gonna hope it did and go to 9000. And here we go, we have this web interface loading up here. And given how terribly slow the iLab usually is, I'm going to assume it's going to be pretty intolerable actually working with it, but I think it's kind of interesting thinking about how you'd set it up and do some other things. Alright, so first thing we want to do is kind of think about, this is the kind of way that we go about configuring things. So we need to configure sending log messages in, and then we do something with the data. So that involves creating extractors, basically rules to parse out log entries, put them into key value pairs, and then we could create dashboards which would show us graphically like log entries, log messages, things like that. And then we could also create alerts which would be triggered on certain events. So the first thing we do is we need to configure an input, and right now we're just going to try and configure a generic syslog input. So I go down here, there's a whole bunch of different things that we could take. We're going to take syslog TCP right now. And input that on our Ubuntu One host, and then I'm going to change the port to be 5144. So if it was just 514, remember if it's below port 1024, you need root to actually run it, or actually bind to the port. And one of the things is graylog has actually created a user graylog and is running as graylog, so it can't bind to the port. So just change that to a different port. And that has now started up, I think. So sometimes the other thing to note is this port will actually change a little bit. You can see you might type something in and it's in use. It'll actually just randomize it and pick something else. So you go here and look at this 5144, and that's the actual port that you're on. So real quick, let's just go ahead and configure syslog. So we're going to say again everything, send it to localhost 5144. So that's just going to take all of the information that we have for our local Ubuntu One machine, and it's going to forward it to that 5144. If we were to look at LTPN, we can see we're listening on 5144 right here, so that should be good to go. So let's say etcr syslog d. Remember, we have that 20 and the 50, and the order kind of matters there again, because the UFW rules take precedence over the default rules, and we want this rule of sending everything to graylog to take the most precedence. So we'll say 10, which comes before 20 and 50, obviously, and say graylog.conf. So we'll take, and we'll put that rule in there, and this just specifies the format that we're sending it, and our syslog can send it in a couple different formats, and that's the format that graylog likes the best. And then we'll say systemctl restart our syslog. It might just be syslog, or I just might have just spelled it wrong. Alright, so we restarted syslog there. And then if we go to show received messages, depending on how over provisioned everything is, we will see our messages coming through right now. And we have this nice web interface of our messages. Okay. And right now, the important thing to note is that the text is super small, unfortunately. Let's see if we can. It's going to be an absolute nightmare to try and zoom that in, I think, unfortunately. We can see the one thing to note right now is that all it says is it came from syslog, what its level was, and the actual message itself. By default, there's no parsing of the message or anything like that. And I think what we'll do is probably leave off for today. Getting into all of the parsing stuff is a bit challenging, but basically we can go through, and what we try and do is there's two different ways that we could do this. There's content packs, and this is the way we'd import, or this is kind of how we do it for Nginx. You can search for add-ons, and there's basically predefined extractors for different things. So the one that I want to look for right now is Nginx. And there's this Nginx content pack. And what this will do is automatically parse your Nginx, and it will give you searchable Nginx logs and everything like that. So you download this JSON, you'd go over here and you'd say import content pack, upload the JSON which defines what to do, and then you'd start it up. And the other way that you could do this is on your inputs, you can manage extractors, and you can write your own extractors based on arbitrary messages, or you can actually import extractors that other people have written. And it's kind of odd when you're doing these content packs, it usually listens on its own port and everything, but I'd want to take all of my syslog information and basically run these filters on everything. So one of the things that you can do is download this content pack and search for extractor, Control F, broken. Extractors. So we have this extractors array of JSON objects, and I could actually go and I could just copy this extractors array right here and everything that this content pack was doing, and there's a lot of things it's doing, so I can't copy it all, at least in the iLab, because it would be annoying. But I could copy that and basically paste it in here, and then we could have nice information. So when I say nice information, again, these logs aren't being parsed out at all, but eventually I could go in and type a query here and be like, or like login user. It might parse to that field, and I could search specifically for this login user, so I could say login user DSU, I could say login user DSU, and I don't remember the exact syntax for specifying time. I could say DSU and time stamp, like timestamp greater than this, less than this, timestamp on the specific day, and so on and so forth. And then you could take those queries, put them into the alerting mechanism, so if something happened, you could send emails, notifications, and then you could take the queries, put them in the dashboard, and then generate nice graphs of what's happening and all of that stuff. And maybe we'll spend some time, and we'll probably spend a little bit of time thinking about that on next Monday some more. Yeah, so that's kind of an introduction to thinking about log management and graylog. So yeah, we'll come back to it more later. I'm still waiting on Kyle to deploy out the networking VApp for the IP tables, DHCP DNS stuff, and that hasn't happened yet. It's DakotaCon. He's just not really doing anything else except for DakotaCon this week. So we probably won't have a lab until next week. So yeah, that's all I have for you. Any questions about stuff we've talked about or labs, anything like that? No class on Friday again? I should probably post that on D2L. Good to go. All right. That's all I got.